Recently, Ahoy, a very high-profile video essayist that I'm sure needs no introduction from someone like me, put out a video trying to statistically analyze the alleged brown era of video games that everybody remembers from the 7th generation of consoles. It's a really fun video, and I think that a lot of how he went about doing it was pretty clever, basically writing a program to analyze footage of various games over the years and taking note of whatever color data he could pull from them. However, it seems a lot of people, myself included, find his conclusions to be a little suspect, and since I'm a nerd and this is a very sciencey video, I thought that I could provide some peer review of his findings and give him some criticism on his analysis. So let's talk about that. Now, to start things off, I think that at least on a technical front, things are starting off pretty well. He analyzed games by gathering footage of full playthroughs of each game, and then used a custom program he wrote to sample various frames throughout that footage and measure their color data. This makes sense to me as there's not many other ways that I could imagine going about this in a reasonable time frame. And when he was first running through his lists of what games scored the best and worst in certain categories, most of the results made sense. For example, the Resident Evil 2 remake was measured as the least saturated game, and it's a game where most of the screen is literally pitch black for much of its runtime, and the Just Dance games scored extremely high in color saturation, which again makes sense if you have literally ever seen a single Just Dance game. Meanwhile, Wii Fit was by far the brightest game in the study, and I mean, literally most of that game is full of bright white blank environments. These initial results seem to pass at least a basic sanity check, so I think that at the very least, the program he wrote to analyze the game footage and assess their color metrics is working mostly as intended, though there were a couple instances that raised some questions. Notably, GTA Vice City got the points for the brownest game of all time, which doesn't seem to mesh well with the usual neon lights and other bright colors that people tend to associate with that game. But I wonder if maybe that's because that game is a bit more open-ended in its design, and it's possible that he might have just gotten some bad footage that just so happened to involve a lot of darker nighttime driving and other gameplay that might tend towards an overrepresentation of brownness in the data. With an open-ended game like that, it could very easily result in a wide variety of potential outputs due to how different people might approach playing that game. Plus, I'm sure that there are various ways that the program that he wrote could be rendered more efficient and sample more frames from each game. There's also probably ways to filter out things like UI elements or to organize the colors that he extracted better and so on and so forth. But for the purposes of this peer review, I think that the program he wrote was at least decently sufficient for the task at hand. I don't think the issue with his findings was the software he used, because the main thing that I want to talk about and discuss as a fellow nerd who has done my own fair share of science fair projects over the years is that I disagree with his methodology of how he gathered and organized his data in the first place. The biggest mistake that he made in this analysis, in my opinion at least, is how he selected and grouped the games that he wanted to analyze in the first place. Now, to be fair, he explicitly wanted to avoid cherry picking, since obviously it'd be far too easy to just grab a few games that are known for being brown and colorless from the time, like Call of Duty or Gears of War or something, and then try to use that as evidence. So he wanted to try and get a representative sample of each year in gaming as a whole. As a result, he decided to go with the top dozen or so best-selling games of each year, only taking out any duplicates if a game somehow charted across multiple years. But there's a big problem with this. Now, feel free to chime in the comments if you disagree with me, but I feel like when people are talking about the brown era of games, that people are usually referring a lot more specifically towards the PS3 and 360 consoles and the games that are on them, and not really including Nintendo in the discussion. Sure, there are definitely a few examples that people can point towards for brown Nintendo games, like how Ahoy himself brings up Twilight Princess in the video, but but for the most part, especially with the Wii generation, I think people generally recognize that Nintendo was not really a major contributor to the perception that this generation was particularly brown. But by just going by whatever was the best-selling games of each year, that means that we're lumping together a bunch of colorful Nintendo games with everything else, and ironically muddying the data with all of that extra color. So, at the very least, I feel like it would have been smart to try and organize these games by what consoles they released on. I'm not saying that he should have just excluded Nintendo from the conversation entirely, he just should have added some filters so that we could have tried to track these trends by the console instead of just lumping everything into one pile. After all, think about this from the perspective of what it would have actually been like to live through the 7th generation of gaming and why people might have this perception about this era's color depth. The vast majority of people did not own all 3 of the major consoles and play every single best-selling game that came out that year. Most people would have only gotten a single console, and that's it. So if you got a 360, well then naturally you're going to be unable to play any of Nintendo's more colorful exclusives like Mario and Pokemon or whatever, and as such, you're probably going to have a significantly darker and browner gaming experience than someone who's only playing on the Wii. After all, the whole point of this analysis in the first place is that we are talking about human perception, what people remember experiencing about that era. Analyzing the data as a fully outside objective observer of every game that came out across every console just isn't actually representative of how people experience gaming. And it's particularly jarring that near the end of the video, Ahoy himself even makes the claim that the 360 and the PS3 were unfairly painted with this brownness reputation, but his evidence against that claim includes games like Wii Fit and Mario Galaxy, games that people with a 360 and a PS3 literally wouldn't have been able to play. He simply cannot make a conclusion about any one specific console when he didn't organize his data by those consoles. So, at the very least, I would argue that instead of just taking the overall best-selling games of each year, he should have taken the best-selling games for each console of each year and labeled the data accordingly. Of course, there would probably be a lot of overlap between the 360 and PS3, but there's definitely going to be a huge amount of games that only released on Nintendo's consoles and not any of the others. And this way, we could make charts of specifically trends in Nintendo games versus Xbox games versus Sony games, and then maybe we would get some more definitive results. After all, not only is Nintendo not usually associated with the brown era of gaming, but it was also the best-selling console of the 7th generation by a pretty significant margin. So naturally, that means that even with him excluding pack-in titles like Wii Sports, the data is still going to be tainted pretty heavily by tons of these best-selling Nintendo titles of the time, like Wii Fit and Mario Kart and Smash Bros. And all of their various pretty colors therein. So it is entirely possible that this could have been the brownest era in gaming specifically for the 360 and PS3, but it would be nearly impossible to see that in this dataset by lumping them all together with games that only released on the Wii. And if it was up to me, I would have also labeled the games by genre as well. Again, I think that most people tend to associate this era with brown shooters specifically more than any other genre, so it would have been interesting to be able to see how things shake down by these specific genre labels to see if there are any noteworthy trends within these genres over time. So for example, we could see if we labeled the games by genre, if maybe shooters specifically were darker and browner in this particular era and then got more colorful later on or even before. Or maybe we could even measure which genres are the darkest or brownest compared to other genres. As he pointed out in the video, a lot of sports games actually are very colorful, or at least very green and not brown, specifically because games like football and baseball take place on massive green, grassy fields. So I'm curious to see if maybe those games score vastly differently if you take them out of the data set. And maybe we could even measure if those green sports games of the era might be less saturated than the sports games that came before and after. Organizing these games by genre could have given us just a lot more ways to analyze this data that I am surprised he didn't take advantage of. And also, let's be real here, because he went by bestsellers, I can't help but feel that sports games are a bit unfairly overrepresented. The 7th gen was already well into the era where we would get a new football and NBA and soccer or whatever sports game every single year, with them barely even changing anything across each title. So even though he excluded the specific games that happen to chart across multiple years, sports games get to skirt by that limitation because they technically released a new game every single year, even though almost every single one of those games is practically identical to one another. And again, if we're thinking about this from the perspective of how people actually play games, I can't help but feel that there is a pretty distinct demographic difference between the people that buy every single annualized sports game every single year and play basically nothing else, versus people who maybe occasionally pick up a sports game every once in a while, but mostly play other genres. So at the very least, if he had at least kept track of what genre each game in the dataset fell into, we could try to see if filtering out things like sports games results in any significant changes in these trend lines over time. That way, we can still avoid cherry-picking the data, but we would at least be able to analyze it in more depth by having these different factors to categorize things by. Finally, the last point that I want to talk about is a little bit more mathy, but it is important when doing any kind of statistical analysis, and that's essentially that it's important to calculate your data's standard deviations, among other things. But the standard deviation is essentially a way of calculating how much variance there is in your data, and in turn, it is used during analysis to measure how notable a change in your trend lines are. If you ever hear the term statistically significant deviation from the norm, what people are usually referring to is something that is multiple standard deviations away from what they expected. The standard deviation is essentially how you objectively measure whether a deviation from a trend is significant enough to be noteworthy, and it is exactly what we should be doing in the kind of analysis that this video is talking about. And on a similar note, it can also be used to sort of measure how reliable or consistent your data is. If your data set results in a massive standard deviation, then it suggests that your data could be simply far too volatile to possibly draw any conclusions from it. And this is actually something that is easy enough to calculate from the data that Ahoy provided in the description of his video without having to waste too much time looking up genres and consoles and whatnot. And in fact, I found a comment on his video that did just that for at least the brightness levels for each given year. And the standard deviations for this dataset look pretty massive to me. If we take a look at 2008 in particular, which seems like the worst one, that was the year that Wii Fit came out, and as a result, the average brightness was the highest out of all years at 30.5%, but the standard deviation was also the highest at a massive 13.5%, likely because Wii Fit was just such a massive outlier, and the amount of samples in the dataset was relatively small, and that means that a single standard deviation from the average ranges from 17% to 43% brightness for 2008 in particular, and that range of brightness literally encapsulates the entire rest of the dataset for almost every other major year, with like a margin of 10% on either side. Now, you could conclude from these numbers that this means that there was no discernible trend, but it would also mean that even the claims that Ahoy tries to make about things like the 6th generation actually being browner and darker than the 7th generation are invalid, because the standard deviations in this dataset are so massive that just about every result from every year falls within a standard deviation of every other year. There just isn't enough of a significant variation to draw any meaningful conclusion from this dataset. However, I think that based on everything that I've talked about up to this point, it's far more likely that this is a sign that the data is polluted by too many variables that weren't taken into account for. for. It seems very likely to me that if we included filters for things like sports games and especially Nintendo games, that we would likely get much smaller deviations within the dataset, and as a result, we would be able to draw much more meaningful and definitive conclusions from the results. And it's also probably worth mentioning that we definitely need a larger sample size, as that would help provide more data points to hopefully reduce the size of the standard deviations and to better account for outliers like WeFit. But I also recognize that there's only so much that one man can do. But, as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. I'm curious what other people's thoughts are on Ahoy's brownness analysis, because just browsing through the comments on YouTube and Reddit and stuff, it definitely seems like I am not alone in my assessment of these results, and I'm very curious to see if he'd be willing to revisit this data and add in a few extra tags and filters to see if anything noteworthy changes. After all, it's entirely possible that even with him taking into account things like Nintendo games and whatnot, that the results might still be inconclusive and might not necessarily prove that there really was a brown era of gaming. There are also other factors that might be difficult to account for that might have led to this brown perception. Like, for example, maybe it's the fact that games like Call of Duty and Gears of War might have been particularly desaturated, but also had lengthy multiplayer modes, meaning that people dedicated a lot more of their time playing games during that era to playing those desaturated multiplayer shooters than they were playing more colorful single-player RPGs and other games like LEGO Star Wars and whatnot. But for now, if you like the video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future, and thank you all for watching. I hope to see you all in the next one.